Welcome to Mad in America webinars, where we are initiating a series that we'd like to do called the RxIT Interview, where we're taking the opportunity to reflect on careers in psychiatry and what may have been learned and what we can look forward to. And today we are very lucky to have Sir Robin Murray. And thank you for coming today, Robin. And I'm going to lead off by saying you are one of the most cited psychiatrists in the world, largely for your work in schizophrenia. And I'm also aware that there are a lot of people in our audience today who have suffered in multiple ways from being given that diagnosis. Many of them are here today because they rejected the diagnosis and stopped taking medication. And they see, or some of them I know, see your apparently recent change of heart around the diagnosis as an attempt to seem open-minded or a plea for forgiveness, or perhaps that now that you've been knighted, you have little to lose. So what can you say to the people who have felt so pathologized and stigmatized, and more than felt, I mean, really, really suffered? And some of them aren't, to be fair, with us today.
Well, I would agree with them that I think one of the side effects of receiving a diagnosis of schizophrenia is that it changes the way one thinks of oneself often, and it changes the way other people think of you. And diagnoses are supposed to be helpful, to indicate beneficial treatment, and also to be helpful to the person in understanding. And I think the diagnosis of schizophrenia does not do that. So I've not used the term schizophrenia in my clinical work for, I think, the last two decades or so. So it's not such a recent change of mind. So I think I was taught that schizophrenia existed. I learned all about it, or what was thought to be known about it. But I gradually, curiously, the more I studied it, the more it seemed to disintegrate in front of me. So I came to the conclusion that it's just a term that psychiatrists use for people who have experienced a psychotic illness which did not immediately go away. So I would just use the term psychosis rather than schizophrenia in practice.
We did discuss a little bit already what the fact that there are a lot of people in the audience today who who have suffered greatly from having been diagnosed, and for a lot of them, because of all the years that you have been, in a lot of ways, a leader in research, for them you are the face of the diagnosis that they've suffered from. And I'm sad to say that there are people who are really angry at you personally, and are not inclined to, quote unquote, let you off the hook for the career that you've had, and are skeptical about what seems to be a recent change of heart about the diagnosis and about the science behind it, and aren't prepared to let you off easily. And I'm just wondering if there's any more that you might like to say or can say.
Well, I think my view is that one should always follow the evidence. And when I came into psychiatry, most of the people who were concerned about people with severe psychological problems were doctors. There was a paucity of psychologists or people with a social background, at least in the UK. So, in a sense, the medical model was the standard approach. And it was only really in the 19...
Just to be clear, this was I'm sorry, this was in around 1972, right?
I started psychiatry in 1972. Although as a medical student, I had lived in what was a mental hospital, or in these days was called an asylum, and I got free board and lodgings in return for carrying out physical investigations. For example, in Scotland, it was the law that people who were in a psychiatric hospital for more than a year had to have a physical examination every year. And of course, at that time, people stayed in mental hospital for years and years. So I got to know people with psychosis when I was a medical student. And so then I went into psychiatry. There was a period when this was the sort of tail end of a period when there were analytical explanations for psychosis, but nobody ever produced any evidence to show that these were accurate, and so it was a medical model. But from the 1980s, more psychologists started taking an interest in psychosis, and I think that's been one of the great benefits of our field, that people came in who were more psychologically minded, and so that helped the field, and it also helped broaden my understanding.
I'm curious, what did you learn from living in the hospital that you might not have learned otherwise?
Well, I learned that most people who were regarded as mentally ill were not violent, and were very pleasant. That this was a big mental hospital with big grounds and a football ground and golf and tennis. So although there were some terrible things about mental hospitals, but there was some opportunity for patients who were really quite well to have recreation. And of course, I had many conversations with people with psychosis. And the thing that struck me was that people were very sensible. I mean, you might think people are mad. They're going to be, they're regarded as mad. They're going to have bizarre ideas about everything. But one would have very sensible conversations most of the time. But there would be particular issues that people would become very animated about and would talk about, which to me seemed to have no basis in reality. So I understood that people who get a diagnosis of severe mental illness, they still are most sensible most of the time. And of course, the corollary of that is that people who are considered normal are not necessarily sensible all of the time. You've had a prominent politician who a president who I don't know was always that sensible, and we have some very strange politicians in Europe as well. So I think the people with serious mental illness were initially in the 19th century treated in mental hospitals and stayed there for ages. So there was a sharp dividing line between those who were considered mad and those who were considered sane. And I think one of the side effects of getting rid of the big mental hospitals, that sharp division between the sane and the insane has considerably diminished. We think in dimensional terms rather than categorical terms nowadays.
Can you explain dimensional terms?
Well, in the sense that there was a famous psychiatrist and philosopher called Karl Jaspers, who said that people with psychosis are not understandable. They have bizarre, strange ideas which you cannot understand. And I think we now know that that is not true, and that what we would call psychotic ideas or paranoid ideas are found not only in people who get a diagnosis of psychiatric illness, but also in the general population. Maybe 7 to 10% of the general population will have an idea which would be regarded as by a psychiatrist as a delusion or an illustration of paranoia. And these are people who get on pretty well with their normal life. So I think we now regard, at least I regard, psychosis as a bit like you would regard a weight. So there are people who are very slim. Most of us, well, sadly not me. I'm on the slightly obese side, but there is a dimension right up to people who are really quite obese. And it's not that is in a sense a category, it's just at one end of a dimension. And so and you might think of anemia, people who are a bit bloodless, they have a loss of hemoglobin. It's not as a category. You're either, 98% of the population is not anemic and 2% are. It's a dimension. So dimensions are very common in the things that doctors deal with. And I think it's much more appropriate to think of psychosis as a dimension, and that many people have the capacity to move up and down this dimension.
I'm thinking it's often been said that there's a 1% incidence of schizophrenia globally. And I think there's a certain implication arises from that statement. Can you speak to that and what you found in your research?
It's nonsense. That much of that comes out of a study done by the WHO in the 1980s, and they said that psychosis and schizophrenia seem to have the same incidence, same frequency across all populations, but that was just because the studies were too small to show a difference. We now know that there are huge differences, that there are some places where psychosis is much commoner than others. So for example, where I work in South London, we've done a big study across Europe with a chap called Jim Van Os, who's a European epidemiologist. And we've shown that in Holland, in Amsterdam, in South London, the frequency of psychosis is about 4 or 5 times higher than it is in Southern Europe, in Sicily and Southern Europe. And similarly, we've shown in the developing world that the incidence of psychosis is 4 or 5 times higher in Trinidad than it is in parts of India or Nigeria. So there's big variations. And it's just, if you look at things like all disorders vary across the world in their frequency. So it's not surprising that there are some places where there are more risk factors to push people into psychosis than there are in other places.
I'm aware of some of your early research, I believe, looked at South London versus Bristol, I believe in Caribbean population.
Well, we did a study 20 years ago when we showed that the incidence, the frequency of psychosis was about 3 times higher in South London than it was in 2 smaller cities, Bristol and Nottingham. And I think this is held up, that if you look at Northern European cities and compare them with rural areas, there's psychosis is more common in the big northern cities. Now, all the textbooks say that is a general a characteristic of psychosis, but we now know that it's not the case in Southern Europe, and we don't seem to have shown it in Nigeria as well. So it may be something to do with Northern European cities.
Yeah, my memory actually is that there was a ninefold variation between urban populations and rural.
No, there's a ninefold. Well, there's about there was a big meta-analysis by colleagues in Australia, John McGrath and colleagues, who found a ninefold difference. We didn't find as much as that. We found in the European study, we found a sixfold difference. But that is a huge an important factor. What is it that drives people into psychosis in certain cities, and what is it that protects people in smaller towns or in Southern European cities?
And what are the factors you've identified?
Well, one of the factors, and this is one area where I have some criticisms of Mad in America, is that I think you would downplay the role, or I have not seen much in Mad in America, which I regularly look at, on the role of drug abuse. And I think one of the commonest causes of psychosis, sadly nowadays, is the use of drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, and cannabis. And South London cannabis use is very, very common. High potency cannabis is very common. Maybe something like 70% of young people in South London would have used cannabis, whereas it's a high potency cannabis is much less common in Southern Europe. There is another point, and which is a more social factor, and I think that is social isolation. I think it's quite easy to become socially isolated in a big city like London. The area where I work is a poor area with lots of migrants and lots of poor people, and people can just get forgotten and lost, and they really have no social network. Whereas my wife is from Palermo in Sicily, and she says social isolation does not exist in Sicily. Social intrusion is what exists. And I think in Southern Europe, I think the family is probably a protective factor. Whereas it's not so difficult to understand that, say, most of us are normalized by our social interactions. If I get a silly idea, or if I'm going on, my wife says I'm talking nonsense. But if I'm by myself and I'm not having proper interaction with other people, I may develop an idea which it really leaves reality. So I think social isolation is a contributing factor to psychosis.
Hmm. You mentioned Jim Van Os. I know that one of his interests is in the relationship between the schizophrenia diagnosis and what's called the fundamental attribution error, which is, the tendency that we as humans have to interpret somebody's behavior as being a product of their innate character or intentions, rather than understanding the person in context. You're talking about understanding people in the context of cities and social isolation. And I guess I think that's an ongoing struggle. I think of it as the work of being human, to always remember to seek deeper understanding of how people have become how they are, why they behave the way they are. And it's been my experience in the work that I've done, no matter how sometimes frightening or inscrutable a person may be, if you can create the conditions to really listen, usually you can get to the point of understanding what they're saying, or why they're, what they're experiencing. And I guess I'm asking, how does that resonate for you in terms of your clinical work and
yes,
the development?
I don't know the phrase that you mentioned, but I would more crudely call it labeling theory. That if you get a diagnosis, then particularly if it's a stigmatized diagnosis, and I mean, it is the case that not all diagnoses are stigmatizing. That in Britain, for example, it's common for celebrities to talk about having bipolar illness or to have anxiety or depression, but clearly it is disadvantageous to be, if I went off, well, it's not going to happen to me at this age, but if one of the younger people who works with me went off sick for 3 months and came back and showed the HR department that they had anxiety or depression, everybody would be sympathetic and so on. If they came back and said that they had schizophrenia, our National Health Service is not at all sympathetic to that, and there would be a question as to whether they would be allowed to practice. So I actually would tell my patients not to say that they had got such a diagnosis from any. But so the point I would make is that I think labeling in all aspects of life is a shorthand, and the average person in the street thinks that schizophrenia refers to a madman with a hatchet, and it's not something that people are necessarily sympathetic about. So we shouldn't get too hung up on diagnosis. I was not taught that the most important thing in psychiatry was diagnosis. I was taught that the most important thing was formulation, that you should formulate the person's symptoms and predicament in the context of their family, their childhood. Where did they have a happy childhood? Did they emigrate? Were they bullied at school? Did they have a happy time at college? Did they enjoy their work? And what adverse or positive events have occurred? So I was always if I had said to my consultant, the diagnosis in this patient is such and such, well, in these days, it was mostly he would have said to me, well, but how does that help you? But what are you going to do for the patient? You want to know what are the precipitating factors, what are the vulnerabilities of the person, and what are the ways in which one can help, both from a pharmacological point of view, but also from a psychological and social point of view. So I think I've always thought that diagnosis was merely a shorthand, and psychiatric diagnoses in particular, they are not diseases. They are constructs. They are disorders, which I think we should regard as I don't have much time for DSM-5, but a disorder like obsessive compulsive disorder or bipolar disorder, these are useful constructs. It may be that when we really understand the mind and the brain, that we'll have an entirely different way of looking at them. But to some extent, they are useful shorthands.
Well, of course, the problem is that once these words exist, once these concepts exist, they take on a life of their own. I mean, I know that you said that you don't use the term schizophrenia in your clinical practice for 20 years. But even in your research, you do use the word, and even this year, a couple papers have come out that you're a co-author on that speaks specifically about schizophrenia. So how do you resolve that dilemma?
Well, I think you might like to say a little more, that one of these was called Schizophrenia Dying but Not Yet Dead. The concept was it was about to disappear, and the other was on schizophrenia as a developmental disorder with a risk of non-specific deterioration, really an argument against the view that schizophrenia is a progressive disorder. So I'm in a sort of odd situation where the bulk of psychiatry, particularly in North America, still considers that there is such a condition as schizophrenia. And if I want to communicate with them, I could write papers on psychosis, but probably my American colleagues would not read them. But I'm certainly well known in psychiatry for opposing the categorical diagnosis of schizophrenia.
I wonder, do you have research you haven't been able to publish because it was too counter to the narrative?
Not, I mean, I'm a wily old bird, so I can usually find. My only experience of that was there are a fashion is to have what are called units for people at high risk of developing psychosis, clinical high risk, or prodromal clinics. And we studied this and concluded that these were pretty useless. And one of the risks was that you labeled people. You know, if somebody said that you were at risk of developing psychosis, well, that is not that's what the clinics were called, at-risk clinics, and you're better off. I mean, the majority of people didn't go psychotic, so why put them through the risk of having such a label? So we had a lot of trouble publishing that because, of course, editors sent it to people who were experts in these prodromal clinics who all hated them. So we went round the hills before eventually we got it. We got it reversed. I mean, I think the other thing that I think is a problem with the term schizophrenia is that it is seen by some as inevitably progressing and deteriorating, and that you can't recover from it. And we know that that's not true, that we've followed up people for 10 years and showed that 60% of people at 10 years were not hearing voices or having delusions or any psychotic symptoms. And of the people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, 40% were not. And of these, half were not taking antipsychotics. So it's quite possible to recover. And I sometimes see people who I maybe saw in 20 or 25 years ago, and then they recovered, and they went on with their lives. They had a family, they got married, they had a job, but they maybe wanted to get an insurance policy. And so they went to their family doctor and said, can you give me a medical certificate for my insurance policy? And the doctor would say, yes, of course, you're very healthy, you've been very well, but of course I'll have to say that you have schizophrenia. But they'll say, but I don't have schizophrenia. I had the psychotic episode 20 years ago. But some doctors believe you can never escape from such a diagnosis. So so I've had quite a number of people have come to me and asked, can I write to their doctor, say that they don't have schizophrenia, which I'm happy to do.
You know, I've wondered why it is that the concept, once it exists, I mean, either in our society or as applied to an individual, is so persistent. It's so hard for people to shake. I mean, when I tried to talk to people about it, I was involved in schizophrenia research 20 years ago, and I've been involved in all this discussion since then. And even now, as I try to talk to people about the possibility, or what I believe to be the fact, that it's a flawed concept and doesn't refer to an actual disease entity, I find it's almost impossible to break through people's just just firm belief that it's a real thing, that it's a and a thought I've had about that recently is I've wondered why that is. It seems particular, and I've wondered if it has something to do with that schizophrenia is a box that we put in. We put things that we are afraid of into. We put the feeling of how frightening and challenging it is when we don't know whether we can trust what a person is seeing or believing, because of how much we depend on each other for what we know to be true, or what we believe to be true. And so that's why even I'll just say, again, that 20 years ago, it was befuddling to me that people would be studied either for trauma or schizophrenia, and you could not build a bridge between the two. If you proposed in the lab that I worked in that there was a connection, I mean, I would just be literally laughed at. And I've wondered about that, why that is. And this is what I'm arriving at, is that it's a box that we put things that terrify us into. And therefore, it's very difficult to open that box and re-examine it. Does that sound?
Well, that may be the case for lay people, but those of us in the mental health services, whether psychiatrists or social workers or nurses, I think we become familiar. I don't know that we are so frightened by it. I may be more fascinated by it. And very few people with schizophrenia, with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, are violent. I mean, it's particularly people who also use drugs or alcohol who may be more aggressive. So I don't that's not my view. I think there is this question of, are there such things as psychiatric diseases? I don't think we should. I mean, a disease implies a biological pathology, and you might say that Alzheimer's disease is a disease. Yes, you can look down a microscope and see the pathology, and there are some neuropsychiatric disorders on the borders between psychosis and neurology, which you might consider disease. For example, temporal lobe epilepsy we would consider a disease, and it can cause psychotic symptoms, or brain tumors can cause psychotic symptoms. So these are diseases, but for what we call psychosis, nobody has ever found. Actually, there was a very famous book written by a British psychologist called Mary Boyle in the 1980s, and she made the point that psychiatrists have never been able to find a pathology for schizophrenia, and all that we always said, what we need is another few lots of millions of dollars to do more subtle investigations, and we'll find that pathology. But 30 years on, we still haven't found it. So these are not diseases in the medical sense. I think personally, I think it's legitimate to say that they can be regarded as disorders, and they're somewhere between the biological and the social, and we have to take into account both the psychological and social and the biological features.
Mm. So then, if the research has been unfruitful, what are the missed opportunities? What should we have been studying, or what would you like to see a focus on? It seems to me that schizophrenia is, or when we're talking about trying to come understand it, I believe we're trying to understand something very, very basic about being human and about what it means to think and feel and be as a human, and what it looks like when that becomes overwhelming and challenging. That's my view. What do you think? What would you like?
I agree. That's one of the reasons why I got interested in psychiatry and in psychosis in particular. That if we could understand the basis of clearly abnormal thoughts, would this tell us something about, say, the normal process of thinking? But these are extraordinarily difficult things to investigate. I have a friend called Chris Frith, who is a psychologist who studied psychosis for 40 years and then gave up. He said, it's too difficult. I'm going to go and study something simple like consciousness. Which of course is ridiculous, but I think we need to be humble and say that I mean the mind brain is just so more complicated than the heart or the kidneys. I mean, you can, if the worst comes to the worst, your kidneys pack up. You can get a donor kidney, or you can even get a heart transplant. You can't get a mind or a brain transplant. So I think. We're just at the very beginning of understanding, first of all, the neuroscience and also the social science of how the social environment influences one's mind. So I think I do not think the research has all been in vain. When I started in psychiatry, nobody had the foggiest clue about what were the causes of psychosis, and there was on the one side there were people who said, well, it's the way there were those who were of analytical view, such as R.D. Laing, who came from Glasgow like me, so I was quite influenced by him for a while. But they said it was essentially the way your parents brought you up that drove you mad, though they never did any tests to show that. And then the other hand, there were those who said it's totally just a genetic brain disease. So there was extreme polarization of views. And when you get that when nobody has any data, as we've begun to get more data, we know what the risk factors are. We know that we know. I mean, one of the things which has happened was that when I was young, those people who were interested in genetics thought there might be one big gene which would cause schizophrenia. We know this is not the case at all. There are thousands of little genes which might make you more or less susceptible to developing psychosis in the context of some environmental precipitants. So there are some normal genes in the brain which might make you more vulnerable in certain circumstances to develop psychosis. So the genetics has broken down the old disease concept and has shown that psychiatric disorders in terms of genetic susceptibility all tend to merge into one, and also that these are susceptibilities to react to your environmental circumstances. And we also know a lot about the environmental circumstances, which we didn't know when I was young. We know that that people who have a difficult pregnancy, or they're hypoxic at birth, or have some early damage to their cortex, that makes them more, that would double your risk. I mean, it doesn't mean you're going to develop a psychosis, but instead of a 1%, as you quoted earlier, being at risk of developing psychosis, it might be 2%. And we know that child abuse is not good for any psychiatric outcome, but it can, again, increase the risk of psychosis. And we know that migration increases the risk of psychosis. We know that being at risk of having personal violence, or living in an area with a lot of violence, can drive up your tendency to paranoia. We know certainly that drug abuse can increase your risk, and bullying and adverse life events. So we know all these things, that these are risk factors for psychosis. The question is, what can we do about them? I work in inner city London, where in many ways the people are poor, they're often migrants, there are drug dealers, in their flats. They're scared to go out in the evenings in case they get beaten up by gangs. The environment is almost psychotogenic. It's inducing of paranoia. So as long as we have the degree of inequality in our society, and some people just are brought up in dreadful circumstances, I think we're going to have these people are going to be more at risk of developing serious psychiatric disorders.
Yeah, so one of the questions that I'm noticing other people want to ask you is, what do you think, what is the correct treatment for schizophrenia at this point? And I think we could go into the history of your development, how your thinking around that has developed over the years. But before we do, it's occurring to me that the answer to that question would not necessarily be to treat an individual. It would be to treat the society in which we live.
Well, I think that is an ideal, and of course, prevention is very important. There are the beginners. Psychiatrists, in the days, the great days of the analysts in the 40s to 70s, the analysts were very expansive and said that we can help the world to avoid wars, and we can suggest all sorts of ways of bringing up children. Then psychiatry became much more cautious about this. But more recently, I think there are, for example, there's a psychiatrist written a book recently with an architect on resilient cities. How could you build cities with more green parks and more nature and more exposure to features which would cause resilience rather than concrete jungles? And there's also a very important British sociologist called Nick Rose who's written a book called The Urban Mind, where he's making the point that the very fact of your circumstance, we usually think that your environment has an effect on your mind, but he's making the point it may actually have an effect on your neural circuits. And I think this is probably true. So I think we're beginning to look at these questions, but psychiatrists have been trained and psychologists have been trained to look after the individual. We haven't, like, actually physicians, physicians long ago realized there wasn't much point, or surgeons, in digging lung cancers out of the chest. It's much more important to try and prevent people smoking. I think psychiatrists have been very slow to move towards prevention, but I think we are now beginning to realize that.
But you've also mentioned that it's it's valuable to know what the actual biological consequence, what the physiological consequences of adverse events are.
Sure.
And that has been a part of the research.
Yeah, of course. So you might think that asthma is a lung disease, but what makes asthma worse? It is the living next to a motorway or inhaling lots of pollution. And so there's a toxic environment. And I think you think of what does the mind do? The mind processes the social environment. And in the same way, there can be a toxic a social environment which can cause adverse consequences in the mind and the brain. And one of the things we do know is that stress provokes an increase in the synthesis and release of dopamine in a bit of the brain called the striatum. And if that goes too high, that can provoke psychosis. I mean, it also occurs with amphetamine and cocaine, and cannabis push up dopamine as well, and are well known to increase risk of psychosis. So you might think that we have all these environmental factors, and one of the ways in which it can provoke the symptoms we call psychotic is by causing dysfunction of the dopamine system. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but and no doubt it will turn out to be much more complex than that. But that has been the sort of the sort of cartoon-like biological explanation of psychosis.
Well, I like cartoons as much as the next person, and so not to pass an opportunity to oversimplify, you have commented on an interesting relationship between elevated dopamine and meaning making. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think we know that that one of the functions of dopamine, amongst many others, is that it grabs your attention. That if surprising things happen, either if you're watching telly and your lottery number comes up, or you're watching the news and the village where you were brought up is flooded, then that releases dopamine. So that tells you to pay attention. This is important. But one of the problems is if through prolonged stress or drug use or other factors, you have too much dopamine, then your striatum is telling you all of these things are important. It's important the way that person looks at you. It's important that you've been driving and you've passed 6 red cars. That must mean danger. Or that that person on the television is mentioning a place that you've been on holiday. That must be a message to you. So this notion of increased salience has been suggested by a psychiatrist called Kapoor as one of the mechanisms whereby excess dopamine can lead people to have unusual experiences. And of course, the drugs I mentioned, which provoke psychosis, are pro-dopaminergic, and the drugs which we have used as antipsychotics block dopamine. So that has been the basis of this dopamine theory.
So that said, what are your thoughts at this point? How have your thoughts around the use of medication evolved, and where are they now at this point?
In relation to psychosis, I think
yes.
The evidence is that the longer people stay psychotic, the more difficult it is to recover. And that you don't need to be a genius to understand. I mean, that doesn't imply there's something biological happening in the brain, but most of us, our memory stores are full of our holidays, our families, our work, happy things. But if you've got 6 months of of paranoid ideas or horrible voices, that's difficult to get rid of from your memory stores. But if you've got 5 years of these memories, they sort of colonize the brain. And so it's important that people shouldn't stay psychotic for a long time. And antipsychotics, I think, in acute psychosis do help that. And there's lots and lots of studies showing that they are beneficial. I think the question which I've been more interested recently, and your founder, Robert Whittaker, has written persuasively about, is the question of how long should people stay on antipsychotics and what dose. The drug companies, of course, would like to persuade psychiatrists that people have to stay on antipsychotics for life. But I personally don't believe that, because I'm old enough to see people who have come off their antipsychotics and have been fine. From my simple-minded point of view, if you have social factors that are pushing up your dopamine level, and you can resolve, or you're abusing drugs and pushing up your dopamine level, and these pro-psychotic factors disappear, then do you really need to keep taking antipsychotics thereafter? So I think one of the big issues in psychiatry is how and when to decrease antipsychotics. And there are a million studies, well, I'm exaggerating, obviously. There are actually thousands of studies from the drug companies showing how to start antipsychotics, but there are no studies on how to stop them. And there are the beginnings of studies looking at this question. And we have been involved in trying to develop methods for decrease it. If you're on an antipsychotic and you get fed up with it and throw it away, there's quite likely to be a rebound, and you may well develop a psychosis as part of the rebound of stopping the antipsychotic. So you have to stop these drugs very, very slowly in order to let the brain normalize. The same goes for antidepressants, so we've been writing a couple of papers on what is the best way to try and decrease antipsychotics to a point where one can, not everybody can come off antipsychotics, that is clear, but quite a lot of people can. The question is how to facilitate more people to come off. And I think the issue is to get in an alignment with the traditional. What has happened in Britain traditionally is that people have recovered from their psychosis on antipsychotics. They've kept taking them for 3 or 6 months as an outpatient. They've come up to see the psychiatrist at the outpatient, and they've said, I'd like to stop my antipsychotics. And the psychiatrist said, no, you have to stay on them forever. And of course, this infuriates the patient, who leaves and says, I'm never going to go back and see that psychiatrist again, throws away the antipsychotics and relapses. So it's much better to try and get into an alignment with the patient and say, well, why don't we very slowly, and I mean very slowly, decrease your antipsychotic? If you're on 4 milligrams of risperidone, why don't we try it at 3.75 for a couple of months, and then another couple of months we'll go to 3.5 and so on. And if somebody's been on antipsychotics for 5 years, you have to go as slowly as that. If they've been on antipsychotics for 6 months, you can probably go faster. But I think the important thing is that the psychiatrist and the patient should see themselves together, trying to see to what extent they can get down the dose of the antipsychotic, in the knowledge that it won't work on everybody. Some people go back to a social situation which is so intolerable that they're still having social stress, which is still pushing up their dopamine, which is still tending to make them psychotic. Now, it would be nice to say you could resolve their social position, but that's not always possible.
It sounds to me that one of the things this speaks to is the necessity of attending to the self-agency, or retaining a respect for the self-agency and the insight of a person into their own course. I'm bringing that up in relation to the fact that there is research by Martin Harrow and Tom Jobe that in their 20-year study, everybody that did get off meds, or I can't say everybody, but that of those who got off meds, there was a 6-fold greater likelihood of recovery. So the people who choose to throw away their meds, they're not, that's not based on nothing.
Well, you have to think. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Martin Harrow's study, and we have done one which is rather similar, and shown that the people who get off their meds do better. But of course, the people who get off their meds, often with the encouragement or acquiescence of their psychiatrists, tend to be those that the psychiatrists are more predisposed to think that they're going to manage. So I think what you have to do is a randomized trial. You have to randomize people to see, this is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, that you have to take people who have recovered from their psychosis and say, we would like you to agree to be in a randomized trial, and half of you will stay on your antipsychotic in the regular way that psychiatrists would suggest you should stay on it, and the other half, we will give you a trial of, we will try and help you to decrease the antipsychotic and help you to get off. Now, there is only one study in the literature on that by a man called Wunderink in Holland, and they found that after 18 months, the people who stayed in the antipsychotic were doing better than the ones who were helped to decrease the antipsychotic. But at 7 years, that difference had disappeared, and the people who had got off the who had decreased and got off the antipsychotic were actually functioning better. So there is this question that, are the antipsychotics useful in the short term, but in many people, are they disadvantageous in the long term? And so there are now 3 or 4 attempts to try and replicate this study, because this study would not have the bias that it's the people with the good outcome who get off the antipsychotics. But it's extremely difficult. I mean, would you or I agree to be in a study where we either continued taking antipsychotics or were were helped to decrease them at random? It's a lot to ask people to agree to, and yet without that kind of study, we'll not get the answer to this question. So in the UK, there's a lady called Joanna Moncrief who is doing such a study, and she's been more successful than most in actually getting people into the study, and the results are about to come out. And the question will be, will she replicate the Wunderink findings or not? And that will be very important to know. Whatever the results are, I think there is a tendency, I think there is an acceptance amongst many psychiatrists that you have to balance the long term. And Robert Whittaker has been a person who's brought this to notice a lot. For any drugs, you have to think, what is the balance of good effect and what is the balance of bad effect? All drugs have side effects, and we have to prescribe something. You have to be sure that the good effects are outweighing the side effects.
There's a phenomenon I think that's very challenging to really consider in this, in light of all this, which is that I know personally a number of people, and while acknowledging the need for careful restraint and not getting off of medication quickly in general, there is the fact that I know a number of people who nearly died one way or another, either from the meds themselves or from a very strong intention to take their lives, who, as a last-ditch effort to save their lives, just decided to get off the meds and did so. And these are among the people I know who are the most accomplished and impressive people that I know. And so I grapple with that. I mean, I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't had taken that chance. And I feel we have to acknowledge the reality that we have, that the world has the accomplishments and the contributions of these people because of the chance that they took. And I don't know how to address that fact.
Well, I'm sure there are such people. I suppose what I would have thought is how was it that they and their psychiatrists were in such disagreement about the question of whether they should come off antipsychotics, well, for example, antipsychotics or not. And certainly when people in the UK, when people are discharged from hospital, psychiatrists don't have the power to insist that people continue to take antipsychotics. The other thing which I should say in fairness is that there have been some large Finnish studies. I'm not sure whether Robert Whittaker is listening, but Robert wrote an article for my journal, Psychological Medicine, about some of the long-term adverse effects of antipsychotics. And the Finnish psychiatrists, they said that one of the things that in their findings was that the people who came off their antipsychotics were more likely to kill themselves than the people who continued. So which I was rather surprised about. So I mean, I think the important thing is that we're paying much more attention to this issue than we have done in the past, and I think we'll gradually clarify it. I think also another thing that, and I'm conscious that people who are not interested in psychosis will have got fed up, and there may be people who are more interested in depression and so on. But one of the things I think we have learned is that psychosis is often driven by anxiety or depression, and that in many cases a treatment for depression or anxiety can actually decrease the forces pushing somebody towards psychosis. So I think one shouldn't see that the only treatment for the people who have a psychotic illness is antipsychotics. Well, we haven't talked about about CBT or family therapy or other psychological treatments at all, which are very, very important.
Yeah. I'd like to open it up to questions. We're working out doing that. So yeah, we have a question from Swapnil Gupta. With your permission, I would like to invite that question.
All right. Well, I mean, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much for conducting this webinar and talking with us. So I'm a psychiatrist, and so I read your article on mistakes I've made in my research career. I was really impressed with the article. But to me, it felt like, why is it coming so late? Because for me, it was a little bit of a shock. But, since the beginning of my training and for at least the past 15 years now, I have been thinking that, yes, people need to be on antipsychotics. Yes, we do need to taper them to a minimum dose. But this idea of there are some people who might not need them at all, and there are some people who might actually get much worse if they get started on antipsychotics because they enter into the cycle of rebound psychosis. And so what happened here? Why did it take so long to reach this truth? And why did it take so long to speak about it? I understand that research progresses slowly, but what about these, thousands of people who have taken meds and many of them for no reason at all? How do we, talk to these people about it?
Well, I still believe that antipsychotics are useful when people are acutely psychotic. And personally, I have always tried to get people to take the minimum dose for the minimum length of period. I had an interesting experience at a wedding, maybe 10 years ago, when a very beautiful lady came up and spoke to me, and she told me that she wanted to thank me, and I was surprised by this, but she said she had been diagnosed as having schizophrenia when she was a teenager and been psychotic for a couple of years, but had eventually come to see me. And after looking after her for 2 or 3 years, we got her dose of antipsychotics down and stopped. And she went on to have a family, and actually she was a lot richer than me because she had gone into finance. So I mean, personally, I've always been of the view that one should try not to have either antipsychotics or antidepressants in the long term. But to go and evangelize about that, you need evidence, and we haven't really had evidence about the long term. We still don't have evidence regarding the long term beneficial effects and why some people do need to stay on antipsychotics and other people don't have to stay on antipsychotics. So I think that I was quite surprised by people's reactions to that article I wrote, and I think you, of course, being much younger than me, come into psychiatry at a point when we know so much more than I mean, I don't know. Have you ever been in an asylum, or have you ever seen people chained to the wall?
Not chained, but I did work in India for many years before.
Okay. So you will know that. I mean, sometimes people in the West have a rather idyllic view of how people with serious mental illness are treated in the developing world, and it's certainly there are many places where it is not pretty. So I think we do. Knowledge progresses, and we have. When I think of the people who were incarcerated in the mental hospital where I started, nobody cared about them. I mean, I think there may be many criticisms of psychiatrists, but at least they care about the mentally ill. The general population, that's the problem with community care. The community does not care, and we've had all these great enthusiasms for treating people in the community, but very few governments spend enough money to support people in the community. Instead, they end up living in the worst part of town, and they live in the worst conditions, and they're maybe living next to drug abusers, and so no wonder they're stressed, and no wonder they break down at all. So I think you're very lucky to. I mean, I wish I was starting out psychiatry now, because I think the opportunities for helping people in the future are so much greater than they were than when I started nearly 50 years ago.
Robin, what is your advice to psychiatrists starting out now to avoid some of the pitfalls you've fallen into, or if you might feel that the mistakes you've made?
Well, I think the main mistake I made was not to challenge orthodox views early. I think I probably have challenged them, but I've not challenged them early enough. And always needs evidence for if you're going to hold to a particular position, then you need to have evidence for that. And I think when I started psychiatry, we had no useful treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, obsessive compulsive disorder, we have excellent CBT for it. For a bipolar illness, the mood stabilizers were just coming in, and I think they have meant that I have known 3 deans of medical school who had bipolar illness and took lithium and got on perfectly well with their careers. So I think we're increasingly developing better treatments, and I think at least in the UK, and I know that this has not been so much so in the US. I think the advent of far more CBT psychologists has been very helpful. What has not been helpful has been the neglect of the mentally ill. But I mean, I think in most Western countries, where do you see the mentally ill, the severely mentally ill? You see them on the streets and in the jail. And this is a dreadful indictment, not only of the governments, but also of the psychiatric associations. What has the American Psychiatric Association said about people hallucinating on the streets or being sent off to jail because the states were economizing on places for the mentally ill? So I would think one thing I would say to young people is you have to advocate for the mentally ill much more. I mean, both psychiatrists and psychologists and nurses and social workers, we should be drawing it to the attention of the government. You can judge a decent government about how much it cares for the disadvantaged, and sadly, many governments just don't give a shit about the mentally ill, and I think we have acquiesced in that to a far too great extent. And why is there so much compulsion into psychiatric hospitals? Because they're horrible. And you would want to go into a place where you were having, if you're having difficulties, you would go into a quiet, relaxing place where you could think your way through your difficulties. Instead, you get sent into a place where psychotic people are bouncing off the wall and interacting, and it's the last place where you get any peace and quiet to recover.
I guess that's a great point. I mean, on the question of compulsion, right, the flip side of the question of compulsion is what are we, as you said, what are we compelling people to do? Another question is, you mentioned the need to have evidence, but I wonder if the other question there is, what are the types of evidence that we consider?
Yes, I think. I mean the classic psychological and medical approach is for treatment is randomized controlled trials, or for investigations is replication. Now, I think there is a place for qualitative studies as a prelude to getting the ideas to do a larger database study. I think for the question of qualitative studies is how do you ensure that they are replicable in a different circumstance. So that would be my view, that you can use qualitative studies to get ideas to study on a larger frame. But you might disagree with that, Kermit.
I don't know that I would. We're trying to find other people to come on and ask a question. I guess again, what would you say is your greatest regret at this point about your career?
Oh, my greatest regret, I mean, not to do with my career, that's not important, but my greatest regret is the life that people with, and the opportunities that people with psychosis have or don't have. I, in 2011, chaired what was called a commission to look into schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses. And we spent 2 years looking at the quality of care for people with psychosis in the UK. We went up and down the country. We listened to patients or users. We listened to relatives. We listened to people in the mental health services. And we said that the care system was dysfunctional. And we came out with 42 recommendations. I mean, 42 was too many, but what then happened was that we got a government that massacred the funding for mental health, so that actually in many ways the care of mentally ill people has declined in the UK rather than improved since that time. So there are so many things that say we know how to help people, and we're just unable. For example, in the inner city, people often don't need insight. They don't need insight. They need somebody to pay their rent, or they need some social help rather than complicated and a psychiatric or psychological intervention. But getting that, as at least as our society in the UK, and I think the same is the case in the United States, as our society become more and more unequal, the mentally ill have an ever more precarious situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to bring on another question. And meanwhile, I want to thank Swapnil. I'm sorry, I actually had thought that we might go a little bit further before you left, but thank you for coming. Hi, Marnie.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
You have a question?
I have a question. Hi, Sir Robin, or Sir Murray, thank you very much for this really informative talk. I was invited to share a bit of my story, and I don't know if you'd prefer me to share my story or to ask a question, because I can do either or both.
You decide, Kermit.
Let's hear a little bit of your story, if you can do it briefly. I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So currently, I'm an assistant professor and assistant dean at a university in Canada. And I'm also a registered psychotherapist. 28 years ago, I emancipated myself from the psychiatric system in Canada by walking away from a system that told me that I had schizoaffective disorder and that I was so ill that I would never work again. And my reason for walking away was I was quite convinced that either the system would kill me or I would kill myself, that I needed to get off the drugs and create my own life, because the system was very focused on all that I would never do in the rest of my life, and not at all on what I could do. And so I felt that the only way that I could actually have a life was to create one myself. And in order to do that, I needed to emancipate myself from the mental health system entirely. So my question is, has somewhat been asked a little bit already, but I'm really questioning about this idea of evidence, and evidence within the perspective of mainstream psychiatry, in that clearly mainstream psychiatry still wrestles with ambivalence about its own role within medicine and its own role within helping professions more broadly. But where we look at this notion of evidence, there seems to be either a willful or for some other reason, a disregard of this notion of the most important source of evidence, which is the service user themselves. And the notion of power imbalance is something that sort of feeds into this and escapes psychiatry, in that there doesn't seem to be a sense of how powerful psychiatry as a profession is, and how powerful it is as a discourse within the larger public sphere. And so the narrative is shaped all day, every day. And so coming down to this notion of evidence, it seems that the most important voice, the authorship of the service users themselves, is either never brought into discourse or research or policy venues, or it is done so in a way that does not regard how biased it is because of the influence of the discourse on that voice. And I wonder if you can speak to any or all of that.
Well, I think it's a very good point. The Schizophrenia Commission that I just mentioned, there were 11 of us on it, and there were 3 experts by experience. So, and that was very useful. That these people had a very distinctive viewpoint, and made some of the points that you make as well. In our institute in South London, we have a department of what we call user research. So I mean, some places you might say survivors or patients or whatever, but it's called the Department of User Research. And so we have consultants and senior lecturers and professors who have had serious mental illness. So and that, I think, has been very useful. For example, one of the studies that our group did, that was led at that time by Diana Rose, was that there's this question: does ECT cause memory dysfunction or not? And patients often say it does, and psychologists often say, well, they don't show it on my tests. And what the user group showed in a paper was that it's autobiographical. So people can do the tests fine. They can do arithmetic and general knowledge and so on, but they can't remember things. They can't remember their own wedding, or they can't. They have blanks after the ECT. So it showed that there was it showed the reason for this dispute was that the psychologists had been measuring the wrong kind of memory. So I think I'm very enthusiastic about, and all our research projects always have people from a user perspective. We wouldn't get ethical permission to do them if we didn't. So in the UK, I think we have advanced quite a bit on that. What I would say is that you can see how powerful user groups have been in things like HIV or diabetes. Somehow or other, it's been difficult for user groups to have the same influence in psychiatry. And I think developing an alliance between the professionals and the users is well. I suppose the other thing is, of course, we forget that very many mental health professionals have had psychiatric problems themselves. I mean, me, I've not been psychotic, but I've had 3 episodes, or really maybe 2.5 episodes of depression, and it is very common amongst the psychiatrists and psychologists. That's maybe one of the reasons why they went into the field to try and better understand their own problems. So I'm not going to defend bad psychiatry. There is a heck of a lot of bad psychiatry around, and maybe you were subject to a lot of that. So the best that you can do is to tell your story and try and explain how you think things could be different, or one might hope they might well be different at present, but one can't guarantee that.
Thank you. I think that I can certainly tell my story, but I can do a lot more than that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Marty. That's a great place to wrap up. I would just like one last question. What, since I asked you what your biggest regrets are, what are your greatest satisfactions from your career?
I think my greatest satisfactions are when I meet people who have who will thank me for my help, or I mean that's why do people go into medicine or into psychiatry? They go in and they think if they help people, maybe they will get some gratitude in return. And I guess one of the things I've learned over the years, when I was young, psychiatrists were taught that you should not show your emotion to your patients, or you shouldn't tell patients anything about yourself. And the longer I've been in it, the more I've realized that it's a good thing to tell patients about yourselves, or about your family, and to treat your patients that you've looked after as friends. Because I've looked after some patients for 15 or 25 years, and it is like meeting an old friend when we meet. So that is something that gives me a lot of satisfaction. I am well aware that there is much, and we haven't talked at all about compulsion and the question of what do you do with people who are dangerous to themselves or to others. That is an extraordinarily difficult issue.
Well, I regret that we couldn't get to that, and maybe we'll come up with a time to do that. So again, so very grateful to you for your time.
No, I should thank you, because I was amazed how many people at least maybe people have not stuck through to the end, but a lot of people signed up, and that the idea that they should sign up to listen to an old codger, like, well, excuse me, a very old codger being interviewed by a not quite so old codger is quite surprising.
Well, good news for you is we have almost as many people now as we did at the beginning. And so you must be doing something, either right or very wrong.
No, yes, of course. But it's been a privilege to have the chance to talk with you and to talk with so many interested people.
Thank you very much. And yes, the chat will be available, and this video will be made available.
Yeah, I would be interested to see the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and we will see you in a few minutes, Robin, just to wrap up. We'll send you up. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to your thoughts and responses and ideas for where to take the discussion from here. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.